To start this build, I planed down some lumber, and like I said in my previous video, I was using this lumber for multiple projects, so I planed down a bunch of it, and it's old barn wood off of a garage that is about 2 blocks away from my shop. So I also didn't mention this in the last video, but if you buy one of these DeWalt planers, it comes with a set, I believe 2 sets of blades, and you can flip them, so it's a total of 4 sets of blades. And I kept the originals after they were worn down, and whenever I'm planing lumber that might have nails in it, which I try to avoid, but especially lumber like this that has paint on it, I'll use those older blades so I don't ruin a brand new set of blades. So I always swap them out to do reclaimed lumber. So this flag display case is going to be a little different than other ones because they wanted to be able to put a picture frame with a letter in the back of it, which means it had to be bigger. So I had the original dimensions for the flag, which is pretty standard, and you could see I kind of mocked up how big my display case would be able to have to be in order to fit that frame in the back, accounting for the fact it had to fit inside the case, and this wood's about 1 inch thick. So after I had that rough measurement, I ripped down some boards to about, I believe these were 5.5 or 6 inches. They were going to be trimmed later, but I just kind of started with rough measurements. The termite damage in that front one obviously will not be used. And then I just cut them down into rough sizes on the radial arm saw. So these flag cases are isosceles triangles, which means on the 2 bottom sides you're looking for a 45-degree angle, and on the top side you're looking for a 90-degree angle. In order to get those angles, you're dividing it in half because you're joining those pieces with 2 angles. So the bottoms are cut at 22.5 and the top is going to be cut at 45, and that will give you those angles. So to do this, I set up my tall fence, I put it at 22, and I just ripped off the bottoms. I have a clamp on the top to keep everything flush, and since it's the edge of the piece, if you put a little bit of wax on the bottom, it will slide really smoothly on your table. So once I had the bottom cut, I could cut one of, so the bottom will have 2 22.5-degree angles on the edges, and then for the 2 side panels, the 2 bottom pieces will also have 22.5, which is what I'm cutting now, and the top side will have 45-degree angles. So I left everything a little long. You could see how that angle matches up, and I tested to make sure my paper would fit in there, and then you could see I kept everything long, so I just went back and marked where those angles had to be cut, and then I could go through and just trim off that bottom. So that is my finished piece. If you're making a regular flag stand, you could go online and find the dimensions that are recommended for them, and you won't have to cut your pieces long because, like I said, the folded flag is going to be a fairly standard size. So I glued those pieces all together, let them set up overnight with strap clamps, and this was my outer frame. So in order to fit the flag snugly, I was going to make a standard size flag display that fit inside the outer frame. So it's the exact same process. I'm going through and cutting those 22.5-degree angles and then kind of piecing it together. This one has to fit inside of my original box, and so the measurements were a little bit easier. I believe I just made this whole thing from scratch. I didn't cut anything long. I believe that bottom piece was about 23 inches long, and the sides were 17, something around that range. But like I said, you could Google if you want more exact measurements. Mine wasn't standard, which is why I'm not really getting super crazy about giving you my measurements. And then I could go through and just cut those both sides, and then I could mark for pivot my square and mark for my 45-degree angle at the top. And I just ended up cutting those on the table saw with my miter gauge. So you could see I'm just making some reference marks, and then I could cut those. You could cut them with the tall fence, but I believe I was working on multiple projects at this point, so I probably had to just take the tall fence off, which is why I'm just using the miter gauge. But everything worked out nicely, and I could glue this one together as well. So it's just a matter of putting glue on all those edges, and these strap clamps come with little corners on them for gluing together boxes to get them square. If you take the little plastic corners off, they work really well as just regular straps to clamp everything together. It worked really well for these flag cases. And then once again, I would let this set up overnight. So this original triangle, it's an isosceles triangle, is going to have a back that opens up so that you could put the mementos in the back side of the case. So this is why I made it extra long, because I could trim off the back, but it will be the perfect shape. Then on the backer, I went through with a router bit and cut a rabbet to receive the back panel for the piece. So this is just a 1/4 inch rabbeting bit that I'm going around the edges. There's a little bearing that will ride along the edge and make a nice groove for you. In the corners, you're going to have to freehand chisel out that excess material. You could see I'm doing it here. And then I could size up the panel for the back, which is just going to be 1/4 inch plywood. This is going to be, I believe, sitting on top of either a mantle or a desk, so it won't be hung on the wall or anything like that. So once I had that done, this is just 1/4 inch plywood that I'm very quickly cutting with my circular saw. I already had I can measure the dimensions off of the opening for the rabbet and just trim down some plywood and have it fit nicely into place there. So in order to adhere that backer to the board, I'm putting a little piece of molding on there. I have scraps of molding lying around my shop all the time because people will give me cutoffs that they can't really use for a house. So this is just it was, I believe, some sort of trim molding where the profile was the same on both sides of the piece. So I ripped it halfway down in order to get enough to trim this out. And then whenever I attach trim like this, I just work my way around. So I put the bottom piece in place, cut my angles, just gauged it to eye, and then put the second piece. Then you could see, once again, I'm just gauging it with my eye, and then I could cut the other and trim out that back side. So originally, you could kind of see it in parts of the video. I was going to have the back side of this panel pivot off of the front side in order to access the back, but then I decided on using the rare earth magnets to attach the backer because they're super strong and it won't be a visible seam once it's stained. So these are pretty thin, they're not even a 1/4 inch thick. So I just went through with a Forstner bit. I believe this is a 5/8 inch bit, is about the diameter of my magnets, and then with some epoxy I could epoxy them into place, attach the magnets, and that is enough for these to stay in place. Just a little bit of epoxy. Could work my way around the entire frame. And then I had this all marked out with a tape measure so I could transfer those marks to the other side and mount those angles exactly the same on the receiving piece. So to fill the gap between the small triangle and the big triangle, I'm using that barnwood as a spacer. So you can see that triangular piece is only not even attached yet. I just have the two pieces in there. I put the frame on top of a piece of barnwood because it's not totally symmetrical, and then I just use the hand plane to plane to my line. Now this I could have cut, but on stuff like this is just old pine, so it planes really easily. I like to use the hand plane because it will hone your skills and you'll get much better at using planes and hand tools without having to worry about necessarily messing up whatever you're working on. So once I had it pretty close, I would just kind of put it in place and trim off a little bit until it was a nice tight fit. Now all of this was going to be glued into place. You could see that that is the spacer. And once the glue set, I put a couple screws through the center triangle into the edges just to hold everything in place. So on the front side of the piece, I used that rabbiting bit again to make a rabbet on my edges, because there's going to be a piece of plexiglass that goes on the front, which means that it's only about an 1/8 inch deep. So once again, I could go around there and then just chisel out the corners to make the corners nice and square, because on a router you're going to be left with rounded over edges. And then I cut the plexi down into a triangle that was the exact height I needed. So all I had to do was go through and mark my angles, and then I could cut that with my plexiglass cutter. I didn't film it, but it's just a matter of scoring with that tool and then snapping it in half, and my plexi fit in there nicely. So on the front side, there's going to be 2 more pieces of trim added, one on the outer edge and one on the inner edge to hold the plexi. So once again, I had this double-sided molding. I ripped a strip off of it, left me with a little bit of a bead detail, and I could just add that to the edge. That edge will hide the seam between the original triangle and the spacer I added, just to make it look a little bit nicer and add some depth to the front of the frame. The nice thing about all this trim is that you're going to buy is most likely pine, and since the barn wood is also pine, at this point I knew this was going to be stained. If you stain it all, it will look nice together. So once again, it was just a matter of going around. I would add a piece, tape it in place, and cut the new piece, just gauging the angles with my eye. And then to attach it all, I just used some brads. For the back side of the opening, I had a piece of another piece of 1/4 inch plywood that I rabbited out the back and attached that. You probably don't need this for this build, but I put it in there so it will hold the flag nicely in place in that front side. So you could take those screws off, put the flag in place, and then reattach that panel and probably never have to touch it again. So for the back side, I wanted to add a little lip to it so anything you put in there wouldn't fall out. So I built it out with some scrap 2x6. These are just about 3/8 of an inch thick and just tall enough so when I add this 1/4 inch piece in there, I could fit the frame in there and it won't go past the lip of the triangle. So I didn't film putting stain on this, but it was an espresso stain, and then I clear coated it with lacquer, and this is the finished look. And I had another piece of detail trim that just had a minor 45 on it, and that is what I used to trim out the plexi. The plexi won't be removable. You'll have to access it from the back in order to get the flag in and out. So it was the same process. I just worked my way around the frame, adding that trim, and then once that was done, I could peel off the protective barrier on the plexi, which I keep on to the last minute because I'm one of those people that scratch up finished materials. And then this is how the whole thing will work. That back panel clicks into place nicely. There's a very minor seam that you could really only see if you know that it's there. You could pick it up and put it wherever you want, but then if you want to access the back, you could just pull it apart like that. And then I just have a couple pictures. I like to show pictures of it before it's stained. This was what it looked like before it was stained, and then once I had the stain on.